The vinegar preservation method was not a kitchen trick, it was a logistics system. For centuries across Europe, vinegar was not viewed as a flavoring or a minor household liquid. It was treated as a preservation medium powerful enough to keep armies fed, villages supplied, and food usable through winters, sieges, and long migrations. Long before mechanical refrigeration, vinegar preservation functioned as a decentralized food security system. It required no ice, no moving parts, no fuel, and no centralized infrastructure. Once vinegar was available, preservation became scalable and repeatable, which is why it endured from Roman times well into the early industrial era. This method was not theoretical. It was used daily in homes, monasteries, military camps, and on merchant routes. Vinegar allowed food to be stored at room temperature for months, sometimes years, without rot or catastrophic spoilage. What matters here is not nostalgia, but function. Vinegar preservation worked because it directly interfered with the biological processes that cause decay. Acidity was the controlling force that made vinegar preservation reliable. Vinegar's effectiveness came from its acidity, specifically acetic acid. Most bacteria responsible for spoilage just can't survive in an environment with a pH below about 4.6. Traditional European vinegars consistently fell below this threshold, even when produced with pretty crude methods. Once food was fully submerged in vinegar, oxygen exposure dropped and microbial activity slowed to a near halt. This was not guesswork. Medieval and early modern Europeans understood through experience that foods fully covered in vinegar did not rot, did not smell foul, and did not cause illness when consumed later. The rule was simple and strictly followed: full submersion, clean containers, and strong vinegar. Failure to meet any of these conditions led to spoilage, which is why vinegar preservation became standardized rather than casual. Vegetables were preserved first because vinegar allowed immediate harvest control. Cabbage, onions, cucumbers, turnips, beets, carrots, and peppers were routinely preserved in vinegar across Europe. The process was fast and required no drying or fermentation waiting period. Vegetables were cleaned, sometimes lightly blanched, packed tightly into ceramic or wooden vessels, and covered entirely with vinegar. Salt and spices were optional, but commonly added to enhance shelf life and taste. This allowed households to process surplus harvests immediately. A farmer could preserve excess produce the same day it was harvested, locking in calories and nutrients that would otherwise be lost. In wartime or during harsh winters, these vinegar-preserved vegetables became essential ration components because they remained edible without cooking and required no fuel to prepare. So, a modern application of this is pretty straightforward. Root vegetables and hardy greens can be preserved today in food-grade vinegar using glass jars, kept at room temperature, and, eaten gradually without the need for refrigeration. The technique really hasn't changed. Meat preservation in vinegar was more of a tactical solution, not really a primary storage method. While vinegar wasn't the main way folks kept meat for the long haul, it sure played a critical supporting role. Cooked meats, especially pork and game, were often briefly boiled, cooled, and then, submerged in vinegar. This process created a hostile environment for surface bacteria and delayed spoilage just long enough to allow for transport or short-term storage. In military contexts, vinegar-treated meats were used during marches, especially when salting alone wasn't enough or when smoking just wasn't practical. Vinegar also revived meats that had begun to turn by arresting bacterial growth, though this required immediate action and a strong acid concentration. For modern survivalists, vinegar can still be used to extend the usability of cooked meats for several days without refrigeration, especially in cool climates. It's not a replacement for salting or drying, but more of a complementary technique. Fish preservation in vinegar really shaped coastal and riverine diets. Across Scandinavia, the Baltic, the British Isles, and the river systems of Central Europe, fish preserved in vinegar became a dietary staple. Small fish like herring, sprats, and eel were gutted, sometimes lightly salted, and then submerged in vinegar solutions. This method neutralized parasites and bacteria while maintaining edible texture. Vinegar-preserved fish could be stored in barrels and transported inland without spoilage, creating trade networks that fed populations far from the coast. This is one of the reasons preserved fish became deeply embedded in European food culture and religious fasting traditions. Today, this method can still be applied using cleaned fish, vinegar, and sealed containers. It remains one of the most effective non-refrigerated fish preservation techniques available. Now, the success of vinegar preservation depended heavily on the container, y'all. Folks used ceramic crocks, glazed earthenware, wooden barrels treated to resist leakage, and, a bit later on, glass. Metal containers were a no-go since the acid would react with iron and copper, messing up the food and making it unsafe. The container had to be clean, non-reactive, and sealable enough to limit air exposure. Pretty important stuff. Lids were often weighted or sealed up with waxed cloth, you know? These principles honestly remain identical today. Glass jars with tight seals really do a better job of replicating those historical containers than plastic does. Plastic can absorb odors, and over time it starts to degrade, so glass is the way to go. You know, this container discipline is really the reason why vinegar preservation scaled so effectively across Europe. The technology was simple, sure, but it was also, well, strictly controlled. Vinegar preservation became absolutely essential during sieges and those long, tough winters. In besieged cities, fresh food disappeared real quick. Often it was the vinegar-preserved stores that decided whether folks could actually endure months of isolation. Unlike salted or dried food, vinegar-preserved items stayed palatable and digestible, which really helped reduce malnutrition and disease. During winters, especially up in northern and eastern Europe, vinegar-preserved vegetables provided the necessary acids and nutrients that kept deficiency illnesses at bay. Applying this knowledge today means, well, recognizing vinegar preservation as a viable off-grid food security method. It requires no electricity and just minimal equipment, making it pretty relevant in modern emergency planning. Vinegar was also used to preserve cooked meals, not just raw ingredients. Stews, sauces, and vegetable mixtures were sometimes preserved by adding vinegar and sealing them while hot. The acidity combined with heat created a stable environment that delayed spoilage. These meals could be reheated later, or if needed, eaten cold. This practice allowed households to cook in batches, conserving fuel and labor. It also allowed armies to prepare food ahead of time before campaigns. Modern equivalents include vinegar-based relishes and sauces that remain shelf-stable without refrigeration. The method endured because it was predictable and forgiving. Unlike fermentation, vinegar preservation did not require precise timing or microbial balance. If the vinegar was strong and the food fully submerged, preservation succeeded. Mistakes were immediately obvious through smell or visible spoilage, reducing the risk of silent failure. This transparency is one reason vinegar preservation lasted so long. Battlefield survival often depended on these clear signs, making the method both practical and reliable. Why this method still matters today for historians and survivalists. Understanding vinegar preservation is not about reenactment. It reveals how pre-industrial societies solved food security problems without centralized systems. It shows how logistics, chemistry, and discipline intersected in daily life. For modern practitioners, the method offers a proven, low-tech preservation option that still works exactly as intended. For historians, it provides insight into how populations survived scarcity and conflict. If you value historically grounded knowledge that still functions in the real world, subscribe to Warpaths of Europe. Share this video with fellow historians, survivalists, and anyone serious about understanding how the past solved problems we still face today. This channel exists to preserve knowledge that mattered then and still matters now.